It is my pleasure to formally introduce you to this afternoon's speaker, Katie Peterson with Public Policy Institute of California, PPIC. Katie is Associate Director and a Research Fellow at PPIC. She's an agroecologist, and she does research on groundwater sustainability, soil health, and ag and water policy. Also, we were just chatting beforehand, and turns out that Katie is a woodworker. So she's got a little backyard wood shop, and she's working on a Murphy bed for her new house. It's a fun fact about Katie. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Katie for today's LunchMAR session.
Thank you, Megan, for the lovely introduction. So first, by way of familiarizing you with PPIC, if you're not aware of our work or haven't read any of our reports, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institute, and our goal is to bring the data to important policy discussions for the state of California. And more specifically, I am with the Water Policy Center at PPIC. So we do work on everything from freshwater ecosystems, agriculture and groundwater, recharge, urban and municipality issues. So anything across water that touches important policy questions. That's part of our purview at the Water Policy Center. So today, let me bring up my slides really quickly. Today, the plan is to share with you the results of, I think I'm sharing the right screen here. Yeah, hang on a second. Okay, is everyone seeing my slides and not my notes?
Looking good.
Okay, great. Yeah, so the goal for today is to give you the highlights from an analysis that we did back in December of 2023 and a report that was released this past summer. Sorry, December 2024 report was released this summer, 2025. This is, I do bear with me. I will do my best to present the results here, but this is the work of my betters, Ellen Hannick and Greg Gartrell, also Spencer Cole, who is here today and has been attending LunchMAR sessions for a while. He's one of our excellent research associates. Full credit for the amazing graphics that you'll see are due to Spencer. So a little bit of background. In June 2024, we released a report on replenishing groundwater in the San Joaquin Valley. This was basically summarizing the results of a survey on groundwater recharge that we put out in the winter of 2023 to kind of better understand what's happening, how much recharge are people doing, what methods are they using, and one of the big questions coming out of that survey was, where do we go from here? And a big piece of that was how much of the water that could have potentially been available didn't actually get into the ground. So how much water was left on the table effectively in that great wet winter we had in 2023. So Ellen, Greg, and Spencer did a rough look at that last year, and they came up with some rough numbers. But this analysis adds a little bit more nuance to that and digs deeper into some of the trade-offs that are at play. So just to preface, it is complicated. We did our best to simplify. I think probably the preferred protocol will be to save your questions until the end, because it's just a lot to get through. So it kind of helps to keep momentum going. But if any really quick clarifying questions or things that would help everybody understand are absolutely welcome, and I'll rely on Megan to flag those for me. So without further ado, understanding water available for recharge in the Central Valley. All right, so I mentioned the survey that we put out in 2023, and the results indicated that we're seeing some good progress on groundwater recharge. We released a similar survey in 2017, which was another year where we received a similar amount of water in the San Joaquin Valley, especially. The exact patterns were a little bit different, but at least overall volumes were similar. And we found that compared to 2017, recharge volumes went up by about 70% in 2023. So that's good progress. It was about 7.6 million acre-feet of recharge that happened in that year. So we asked folks in that survey what methods for recharge they were using, as I said, what things at the state and local level helped or hindered, and basically what would they like to see happen. And in general, I think folks were happy with, for example, the on-the-ground support that DWR provided, which were things like just helping to coordinate, getting pumps available for people, making phone calls, just a lot of coordination. And then there were the executive orders that came in either in March when it became clear that there really was going to be a lot of water. I think that may have been late in the game for some, but those executive orders basically said that for flood flows, under certain circumstances, you can take that water, you can divert it, even if you don't already have a permit from the state board. And then I'll reference SB 122 a couple times in this presentation. That was the codification of those executive orders using more or less similar language, and that's now in the Water Code section 1242.1, 2, and 3. So 2023 also saw a lot of local innovation in terms of recharge partnerships. We saw a big increase in the number of entities doing landowner recharge on their lands, on agricultural lands in particular. We saw some incentive programs getting underway locally that really helped get that moving, either by paying folks or giving them credit for the water that they socked away. So that's gaining momentum, and the survey indicated that we did pretty well, but there's definitely more indications that there could be improvements, more could be done, and there's more water on the table. So we estimated about 3.5 million acre-feet more water could have potentially been available for recharge in 2023 that didn't get recharged. Some of that would have been available without any impacts whatsoever to downstream users, but not all of it was without trade-offs, and that's kind of what we want to dig into today. All right, so big picture, we need to start with the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. The Delta is really the key issue for recharge, both in the Sac Valley as well as the San Joaquin Valley. So you're looking at a bird's eye view of the Delta, essentially. You've got the Sacramento up in the north and Stockton kind of in the lower right-hand quadrant of the map. I'm sorry, mouse went rogue there. Okay, back to our map. So the yellow arrows here are showing inflows from the Sacramento River and from the San Joaquin River. And the orange arrows are showing you exports. These are going to the Bay Area, to the Valley, to Southern California, and also a little bit to the southern coast. And then the pink arrow is showing you the required outflow from the Delta. So, and also outflow that's maybe extra or not required. The arrow represents both of those. And in wet years like 2023, there can be a lot of extra. So that's the water that people are talking about and that we're trying to get a sense of here that might be available for further recharge. And I'll just note that we made the assumption in our analysis that each river's share of that pink arrow is proportional to its share of inflow, which is a little bit of a simplification, but that's the way that we were able to decide how much the Sacramento River versus the San Joaquin River contributes to exports and to in-delta use and other various ways that we needed to slice and dice the data there. Okay, so let's talk about those minimum outflows for a moment. Who's subject to those minimums? By law, it is the projects that export water from the Delta, the Central Valley Project, or the CVP, and the State Water Project, or the SWP, and that rule goes back several decades. At the time, that rule was basically the minimum outflows were meant to keep the Delta fresh for in-Delta use, and then various environmental requirements were kind of layered on top of that. But the CVP and SWP are ultimately responsible for meeting those outflow requirements. So if there are ever any additional diversions upstream, that might cause the exporters to have to release their own water from upstream reservoirs to meet outflow requirements or reduce their exports and so forth. So fairness of those diversions, any additional diversions, is basically based on whether the delta is in excess. And the delta being in excess means that there's enough water in the system that exporters wouldn't have to do anything additional to make up the required outflow. So this is, let's see, it's a bigger issue volume-wise on the Sacramento River. It's just a bigger river. The San Joaquin River is more complicated. It's smaller. It contributes less to the overall supply in the delta. And there's also more demand for recharge from the San Joaquin River. There are additional rules that apply on the San Joaquin River also. The Old and Middle River rule, the flow limit being one of them. That limit restricts how much reverse flow you can cause. So those rivers in general, they flow north, but the export pumps are located in the south of the delta, and they can cause the river to flow backwards when there's a certain amount of flow in them, and that can be harmful to fish. So the OMR rule is designed to protect against that. And then we also have the inflow-export ratio that places similar restrictions on exports. So these are the rules that are relevant for when flows at the Vernalis gauge in the very bottom of the map here are below flood stage, and they kind of are layered on top of whatever environmental requirements are already there. Okay, so long preamble to get to the meat of our analysis here. What we're looking at is daily inflow from the Sacramento River for the entire water year of 2023. And we've divvied that up into different elements. So what is the blue on the bottom here is that required delta outflow. So that's proportional to what the Sacramento River would contribute to outflow. And then the orange red in the middle there is the Sac River's contribution to exports and to use in the delta in that year. And then the yellow, all of that yellow area with the peaks around January and April is what's left. And this is the water that we're talking about when we talk about water potentially available for recharge. So you can take another look at that yellow water, if you want to call it that. And you can parcel out water where there could be flood conditions in different places on the Sacramento at different levels. So this is the water that would be flowing through the delta when conditions are such on the Sacramento River that water starts getting diverted into the YOLO bypass. So that's at about 70,000 CFS. So if you coarsely divide that up, that's about 1.8 million acre-feet of that yellow water is flood flow that could have been taken under, for example, the executive orders in the Sacramento Valley. Then the gold is now, the gold yellow color is other potentially available water. So this water, most of it is probably not going to meet the conditions of the executive order or SB 122, but some of it might be safe to recharge without hurting the environment or without hurting downstream users like the export projects. So this is mostly when the delta is in excess. So this is the space where folks would have to work out in policy discussions, for example, how to permit some of this, and that kind of sits with the State Water Board. So the Sacramento River is a little bit simpler. The San Joaquin River is more complex. Again, there's a smaller river and there's more demand for recharge. There are also additional rules that apply that can create more trade-offs. So you can already see we've got an extra color here. The darkest blue are the minimum flow requirements on the river itself. And then the rest of the blue is the additional delta outflow minimum requirements, or at least the San Joaquin River's share of that. So the blue is basically our required margin of safety for the river. The orange, again, is the San Joaquin River's share of exports, and the yellow is potentially available water, the stuff that's not required for delta outflow or for environmental flows. We can divvy it up in the same way and show you where flood flows would be occurring. And in this case, we assumed that flood flows were when Vernalis is at 21,000 CFS. The gauge is at 21,000 CFS. And when you're below that flood stage, so anything that's not green here, in the Sac River, this was other available water. Here it's the trade-off space. And that's because when you're at this stage in the middle of this chart in the yellow, the old and middle river requirements start coming on board. The IE ratio requirements start coming on board. So you can't always make additional diversions without impacting downstream users. That's kind of what we want to look at here. So I'm going to show you two scenarios. One scenario where export projects, the CVP and the SWP, are exporting the maximum that they're allowed to export under law. And then the other scenario will be showing more realistically actual exports, because the projects can't always export everything that they're entitled to. So starting with the maximum export scenario, let's say that the State Water Board says, all right, you can divert all of that available upstream water. There's capacity to take all of it. Then what would happen is exporters would need to reduce the amount that they export by about 1.4 million acre-feet. So more than half of that trade-off water space. And that's the lighter blue area that you're seeing in this figure. And that's, again, related to the restrictions that kick in when inflows from the San Joaquin River are below certain levels. So that's reason for concern. And basically, when you break it down, that means every additional acre-foot diverted upstream, exporters have to cut back by 1/2 to 3/4 of an acre-foot. So that's in a maximum export scenario, when exporters are taking everything that they could take by law. But in reality, and what a lot of Greg Gartrell's work with us has shown, is that exporters haven't really been able to do that most of the time. There's usually some water left on the table for them, and it might be because at a certain point, San Luis Reservoir fills up. They don't have a place south of the delta to store water. It could be because of restrictions to protect fish, et cetera, et cetera. So the light green area of this next graph is showing you the water that exporters could have taken, but they didn't. So this is potentially available water from unused exports. What that's doing is basically shrinking the trade-off space. Basically, with this water, that's where, if folks could work it out, if there could come to some agreement between exporters and other diverters, it could be possible to take that water for recharge and use it to mutual benefit. And again, that's water that is already available by law, stuff that exporters can take by law under the regulations. So yeah, that shrinks the trade-off space to about 1.7 million acre-feet in the actual export scenario. Okay, so that's a lot of the figures and numbers, and I know that's kind of a lot to digest, but I'll just keep moving here, and I want to talk a little bit more about what all this means for policy and how we manage our recharge water in practice. The big picture thing that we learned from this analysis is that there are trade-offs between new upstream diversions and existing exports, and those have to be considered when we're trying to understand how we can capitalize better on water available for recharge. So there are two issues. There's one issue around when and how much flood flow can we divert, and how to fine-tune that. And then there's also the issue of how much of the water that is coming in below flood flow levels could also be available for recharge. And that's kind of the area where folks are thinking about how can we improve things. So again, we've shown with this analysis that even in a wet year, there can be major trade-offs between new upstream diversions and existing exports. That's what we showed in the charts. Exporters can lose half or more than half of the additional amount diverted upstream. Now, upstream users don't always have an automatic water right, but there are area of origin laws. These were designed to protect upstream diverters who preceded the projects, especially in those areas where people didn't fully develop all the water they might use in the future. So those folks could make the case that they should have priority, even if their diversions do harm exporters. So this is a matter that would have to be worked out either in policy discussions or in the courts. So that's a major thing to consider. And then, so if you'll remember that the green and blue areas and the maximum versus actual export scenario, we showed that there's still a lot of room for doing more through partnerships with exporters because they can't always operate at capacity. And that means there might be some opportunities for recharge that benefits both the folks doing the upstream diverting and the projects themselves. So obviously this needs to be done in a collaborative way, but that seems to be an opportunity that we could figure out how to divert more of that water. I do think that exporters are trying to figure out ways to use their capacity better. And one example is in wetlands, where we've seen major increases in recharge, but there's still room for more gains here. And even in that trade-off space, there's room for collaboration if one can figure out how to make the exporters whole at the end of the day. So partnerships between exporters and upstream diverters will be key. Some of the exporters even have money they could bring to that party, interest in some of the water. So there's a lot more to explore there. The next implication for policy is more flexibility. So thinking about flood flows, a lot of the debates around the language that ended up in SB 122 have been about avoiding harm to exporters. But a lot of it is also about making sure that when it really is flood flow, flood level situation, that water ought to be diverted to provide flood protection. So this should basically be considered one of the benefits of recharge diversions. We had the unfortunate example of Planada in 2023 in Merced County, which flooded very badly in early January of that year. And that happened at a time when Vernalis gauge readings were not showing flood stage. So basically that official flood stage at Vernalis kind of definition of flood flow, that wasn't the case when Planada flooded. And this can happen anywhere across the Sacramento and San Joaquin watersheds. There are going to be situations where there are local flood conditions at times where diversions could have some impact on exports based on the definition of the delta being in excess. So what we think is needed here is the flexibility to allow some diversions in those circumstances, but having protocols or agreements in place up front so that you can find ways to make downstream users whole after the fact. Then what happens with environmental regulations? That's the next question. It's one thing to look at past regulations, but what about the future ones? These are changing. There's a lot of moving parts. So I will say that we didn't really go there with this analysis. But what we can say is that in very wet years like 2023, most of these different regulations in play are probably not going to make a big difference to our conclusions. They might matter a lot more for those borderline kinds of years. But I think a lot of these debates around additional recharge diversions are about making sure that they don't harm the environment, especially if they're very easy to permit or to do without a permit. Yeah, so I think we can say that the state board has been pretty cautious with that, and they're using their 90-20 rule for permit applications, and that's designed to prevent that environmental harm. But it's also caused some frustration because it can be cumbersome, it can be difficult to implement. I will throw out a reference to the functional flows approach that a group of environmental groups and academics has been working on for many years. And that approach shows that there are situations, if you're tracking daily flow levels, where you could potentially recharge a lot more non-flood water, non-high flow water at certain times than what would be allowed under the 90-20 rule. So that's another thing to explore a little bit more. Finally, for water for recharge. So we've been talking about permitting or access to recharge water without permits, and that's important. But it's not the whole problem in terms of unlocking more potential recharge. In our survey back in 2023, we found that one major hurdle for recharge was getting permits just for building and operating projects, not talking about getting the water yet. So things like stream bed alteration permits and so forth. Those can take a long time and can be a big obstacle. And another thing is preparedness at the local level. So we found that the localities, the entities that had already done a lot of planning, maybe had put in the work on their GSPs, that really made a big difference in terms of being able to do more recharge in 2023. So another thing that is still expanding that could have a lot of potential is getting more landowner recharge in place. And to do that, first we'll need good accounting systems, and we'll need some sort of fair compensation. So that's another area where local policies could make a big difference. And there are studies coming out of DWR as well that are showing that some of this can really help with flood protection as well as recharge. So there's more to do on the state and local level beyond just this permitting of diversions. Okay, so I will leave it there, and I have some links to the June 2025 report that has more detail on our results here, and I think I can coordinate with Megan to figure out how to share those with you, as well as our 2024 report on the survey of groundwater recharge and a data set that was kind of foundational to this analysis on the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. Thanks again. I'll stop sharing for questions.
Thanks, Katie. I'll dig up those links and put them in chat in a moment, but let's give folks a minute or two to marinate on what you just shared. Got a lot of applause being shared right now. And folks, you're welcome to ask any questions or share a comment in the chat. We can read it for the record. Also, mostly because the chat does not get recorded, so we have to verbalize what is shared in chat. Or you're also welcome to just raise your hand and come off mute, come on camera, and engage with Katie directly. So it looks like Ryan's going to get us started here. Ryan asks, at the top of the presentation, the figure of 3.4 MAF was available for recharge. It looked like that number was specific to the San Joaquin. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes. So I'm trying to find the slide. Yes, okay. So that is specific to the San Joaquin, and I can show you that slide again. And there certainly would have been, so all right, let me show. So Sacramento, that potentially available water was 11 million acre feet. In the San Joaquin, it was 3.4 million acre feet. But we wanted to highlight this in particular because, as I said, the San Joaquin River is where you see more trade-offs starting to come into play. And it's also a very important river for recharge and so forth. Not that there's not a lot of interest in recharge along in the Sacramento Basin and Sacramento Valley as well. But it's just a little more complicated in the San Joaquin.
Adam asks, did the analysis consider the physical limitations of diversion facilities? For example, Orange County Water District is limited in diverting water from the Santa Ana River when flows exceed 1,000 CFS.
Yes, that's a great question. And the answer is no. This is a very high level analysis of one particular year, just 2023, not across years or types of years. So it's important to consider that when we're talking about how to interpret it. And a lot of the conclusions rest on the assumption that it is actually possible to take all of that water and put it somewhere or get it to where it needs to be. And that's not necessarily the case across lots of the valley. So yeah, that was a little beyond our scope, but it's an important thing to consider for next steps.
Thank you. And folks, you're of course welcome to come off of mute and engage with Katie. I know I'm a broken record there, but open offer. So Gretchen asks, were there any considerations of the environmental benefits of the high flows in the analysis?
So that is That is a question that has been brought up many times, and it's sort of a space for further investigation in our minds. So this is really just based, it's a little bit tactical, and we can kind of base our definition of flood flow on what the existing defaults are for those particular rivers. But I think there's still plenty of debate between the environmental community and other users about what is non-negotiable flows in those rivers, how much benefit do we actually get from those high flow events, first flush and so forth. And is there a way that we can take that into account when we're talking about how much water we might potentially divert upstream for recharge purposes? I think that's still a bit of an open debate, and it's not something we touched on here, but I think it's definitely ripe for further discussion. And please, I know there are a lot of people on this call who are more knowledgeable about this than I am, so I welcome you to hop in and elaborate a little bit further on what I'm saying.
Ryan wants to jump in.
On that topic, but I don't know if directly responding to that, I think sort of one part of this as you're considering that question, if you go down that path, is not just what are the benefits in the moment of high flows, but what are the benefits of moving that water into recharge to address low flows further down the line, right? So I think sometimes we get caught up on this question of, is the water valuable? I think the answer to that question is always yes, but I think a more important question beyond that is how can we prioritize the value of that water moving forward? And so I think that becomes a very complicated question. But I think that's one that sort of gets wrapped up in this question of like, what are the benefits of the high flows? I think, again, part of it is what are the opportunities in all conditions moving forward of those high flows. So I don't think that was a question so much as a thought, but feel free to.
No, but that's really helpful, because I think to clarify what we can do with this analysis, it's really just to say what's possible and what are the considerations, and it's not to say what should we do. So that's really important to remember. That's why we call it water potentially available for recharge, and not just, oh, well, all that yellow water in our figures, we can just grab it and put it in the ground. We have to think a little bit in a little more nuanced fashion than that. So really, this analysis is kind of the starting point for that discussion.
There are probably a lot of people on this call that are seriously pondering that question. I just shared the 3 links associated with that last slide that Katie had up. I was using shorthand, but it's the links to those 3 publications from 2025, 2024, and 2023. Daniel was just sharing in the chat a secondary response to Adam's question, noting that the DWR San Joaquin FloodMAR watershed studies did take into consideration the physical diversion capacity of water districts, and those results will be shared out at the December LunchMAR session. So thanks for the plug, Daniel. December 3rd LunchMAR. Also, a little preview of those results at the November 5th and 6th FloodMAR Forum. Shameless marketing. What else do you have, folks? We've got about 10-15 minutes left with Katie. So you may have seen this publication in months prior, but now's a great time to get out any questions or just engage in a robust conversation with your colleagues in this space. And Katie, conversely, not to put you on the spot directly, but would you have any questions for this robust group of folks where you would maybe be interested to note or inquire how they might be using this information in their work?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions questions for this group, so I feel like that could open up a can of worms. But I mean, one thing that we at PPIC have been thinking about is what is the next most important question that we can address? Like, where can we take this analysis? Is it most important to think about, okay, how can we apply this in years that maybe aren't as wet as 2023? Are there ways we can think about how to do a better job of recharge in all kinds of years instead of just wet years? Is that the big question in folks' minds? Is it more how do we agree upon how much water is needed to protect the environment, to layer on top of the other considerations for downstream users? That's what I would love to know, is where can PPIC deploy our efforts to best effect, kind of to attack some of the gnarly questions that are wrapped up in delta and recharge.
Any brave takers?
What's top of mind?
If you let's start. Excellent. Let's start with Poyam. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your
Yes, that's right, Poyam. I guess what's coming to mind is, you know, one of the trickiest parts is on the ground, what happens, how do people agree, how do people work together? And so even before getting to that step, there is an analysis that's necessary, which is who's doing what has worked, and why. And so, you know, that there's different parts, there's different analysis in that question, those questions. But I see that as one of the critical components to getting things working on the ground, and figuring out where effort is best placed and what type of effort is that. So yeah.
So can I follow up a little bit, Poyam?
Sure.
Is that question mostly related to what are the infrastructure needs and how, or is it more of a governance sort of thing?
Yeah, I'm thinking more of the governance aspect in terms of the governance and just cooperation, right? So how do you figure out, how do you get people to decide, oh yeah, this is a good idea, I want to do this on my private property, and then how do you get people to agree to whatever agreements are necessary, whether that's public or private people who need to participate in those agreements.
Kind of what are the right incentives? Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yeah, and what's worked, right? So in certain places, some of this is being done in different places, and it's working in some places. Often it's people who see the benefit and just want to participate at this point. But going forward, you know, I think Ryan, you know, he spoke to this a little bit in talking about there's these, if the more water you bank, then the more off-season flow there is. Well, there is some benefit to that to private landowners. Whether or not they see that or not isn't clear, and then that changes depending on where you are. What is the ground like where you're doing the recharge?
Right.
Thanks, by the way. It's very interesting.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate the input.
So I appreciate the open-ended question, Katie, which is dangerous because I for a long time. I think the first question that you asked was sort of year types, like where would I prefer you focus? My personal view, for what it's worth, is on the wet years versus sort of the in-between year, and that really just is because the hydrology, typically we don't get sort of a narrow in-between year very frequently, right? We're sort of one spectrum or the other, and all of our analysis on climate change really says like we're more likely to fall on those extremes than in the middle, although that's maybe not a fair characterization of the analysis, which is just expect the unexpected. So anyways, that would be my first question. And then on sort of along the lines of where Plan was going, I think the places to focus are sort of incentives and barriers, right? Because I mean, your analysis said there was something around 8-9 million acre feet in the Sacramento in 2023 that was sort of above the environmental requirements, exporter needs, and below flood stage in the Sacramento. That seems like a really big opportunity, right? But then the question becomes, why aren't people taking advantage of that opportunity to a greater extent? And to me, that is a question of what are the barriers and then what are the incentives? Because I mean, I think from my perspective, one of the big barriers is wrapped up with incentives, and that's permitting for that water, because the flood flow diversions are a great option, but as I understand it, people are taking on sort of risk and investment to divert those flood flows. And that really is just to the benefit of their basin, right? They don't really get to stake a claim to that water. And that's the space that I think we need to sort of identify how do we make progress on, is how do people get to divert the water and stake a claim to it? Because that's when they're really going to take on the risks and challenges of implementing those kinds of projects. So, I mean, that's my worldview again, for what it's worth, and appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. And to your point about, I think your point about the incentives and barriers is very well taken. And I know there are folks probably in this group that are working on it. And then to your point about the year types and the more normal-ish years being the least common, I also think, I'll add to that, I think it would be interesting and also relevant to look not just at year types, but also wet periods, because we can have a really wet storm and a really flashy event in the middle of a drought. And that's also an opportunity that we should think about. So yeah, that's a good point.
And if I can build on Ryan's comments, completely agree with everything you said, Ryan, but additional barriers that we're seeing, and I'm Noelle Kramer with Wine Institute, that our members are seeing is not only the water rights permitting necessary and sort of the unknowns when you enter into that process, but also the water quality permitting. If it's not flood flows, and then when you're land applying that water, do you need to go through a CEQA analysis and get a WDR from the regional board? And so it's like, what are identifying all the barriers and looking for ways that we can work together to find solutions that will be incentivizing recharge and without having impacts. And are there like pathways that we could find that to make that happen?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Noelle.
David, go ahead, and then I'll go back to a couple of comments coming into chat.
Sure, just to respond directly to that, as one of the many faces of the state board is that the state board has worked on some of the water rights permitting issues, as this group probably well knows, with well, 1242.1, which is you get out of a water right and potentially out of water quality permitting. But then, also the new pathways for getting a water rights permit are now in place. And with regard to the water quality permits question, that is something that we've been spinning up an effort over the course of the last 6 months to a year to look deeper into, and I would kind of follow up with Megan's shameless plug. I'll be presenting on this at GRA, as well as the LunchMAR forum, about where we stand with that, which is still pretty early, still spinning up this effort, but we're definitely working on it internally.
So if I could just clarify real quick, David, you're referring to the short-term permitting pathway, like the temporary 180-day or 5-year permits?
Correct.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
An earlier response from Gretchen to your broad question, Katie, was she would love you all to dig into the environmental component.
Okay.
Spencer, also from PPIC, was just offering a little bit of follow-up here. He said, regarding how often do we really get wet years like this? In the past 15 years, we've had about 3 such years in 2011, 2017, and 2023. So on average, maybe once every 5 years or so, with some moderately wet years thrown in as well. And to go back up to a question from Tony a couple minutes ago, about 10 minutes ago, Tony asked, did you look at average or dry water year flows? What would be the frequency of these high year flows you analyzed?
Yeah, so I think this speaks to Ryan's comments earlier, as well as my explanation of where this analysis sits. And basically, we looked at only 1 year, 2023, and it was a wet year, and that's it. So the analysis doesn't really consider more average or drier year flows. That's a potential area that we could dig into a little bit more. Guaranteed, the trade-offs are going to be greater. It's going to be a lot more complicated than years where you have these very high flows, where SB 122 kind of plugs in and then gives you a little bit easier access to those flows. And then I think Spencer's response in the chat here gives us a little better idea of how frequently we can expect these kind of years. We had one in 2017, one in 2019, then 2023, 2024. So once every 5 years or so, give or take. But again, as Ryan said, in California water, just expect the unexpected.
And a new question from Ryan Fulton. How does DWR use this information to determine where demand management, for example, land fallowing, is needed?
Interesting question. And maybe other folks in the meeting can help me with this. I'm not sure to the extent that DWR actually is involved in those determinations. To my understanding, it's more the local GSA level. And it depends on the kinds of demand management activities they're implementing. So do they have a fallowing program in place, for example? Do they have allocations set up? So yeah, thinking about it at the local level, can this information be used to determine where demand management is needed? Possibly. I hadn't really gone down that road in my thinking, but part of it is understanding where can we take advantage of this extra water? Where do we have the conveyance in place? Where do we have kind of the more local and regional storage in place to hold that water for a little bit so that we can get it in the ground? And then places where that's not possible, I would imagine those are more or higher priority areas for demand reduction, e.g. fallowing. So again, please chime in if I'm not getting the whole picture with that response. But that'd be my initial assessment.
Well, you did get a floating thumbs up from I think it was Peter from DWR as you were replying. And Kiamyar was offering a little bit more response in the chat, saying as part of Sigma implementation, each GSA is looking at a portfolio of strategies to meet basin objectives, including water use efficiency, flow augmentation, land repurposing, etc. Just what you were touching on, Katie.
Yes. And I will say, like, on the whole, if you look at the groundwater sustainability plans that each agency has put forth, they're relying quite a lot on groundwater recharge as a strategy to augment their supplies. So this is definitely the preferred approach, and then demand management is much less preferred, because it's about, you know, reducing. You know, it's not very fun. It's very hard for everyone involved, but we need both, obviously.
Well, it's a nice segue to the last question I think we'll have time for here. Eliza was asking, is there a concern of an increase in contaminants, especially with landowner recharge?
Yeah, great question. I don't have the answer to that, but I know a lot of people are working on that. There are studies in progress, for example, out of UC Davis on whether recharge can be done on former dairy lands. And is the dilution effects that you create by flooding that land with a lot of water all at once, does that outweigh the possibility that you're mobilizing some contaminants that were locked up in the soil profile? So I don't know, but I think there are a lot of folks working on that question, and hopefully that's definitely some of the work that needs to be done to understand what areas do we prioritize for recharge, what areas should we avoid, and we just need to know that to be ready to roll these projects and ideas out as efficiently as possible.
It's a great question, and there are a lot of folks working on that. Last shameless plug, we do have a session at the LunchMAR Forum event about water quality and recharge, and we'll hear from other folks like Sustainable Conservation and our action team, who is our LunchMAR Network action team, who's exploring this question right now. So there was a question of if the PowerPoint will be available. So I think you'll have to reach out to Katie directly if you'd like a copy, but our recording of this session will be posted to the floodmar.org website probably by next week. So you can always go back and scan through that and pause on the screens that have the content that you're interested in reviewing. We are just at time, folks, so 1:30, and I'm just going to quickly read Spencer's last contribution here in chat for the record. The DWR Sigma portal recently created a new tool showing the projects and management actions GSA are planning to pursue, and direct aquifer recharge makes up about half of the planned overdraft mitigation for the San Joaquin Valley. Certainly seems to be a lot of demand in this area. Katie, thank you so much for your presentation this afternoon, and thank you for all of the work that you and your colleagues at PPIC continue to do in this space. Everyone, thank you for joining us today. I hope that your September is off to a great start and the rest of the month goes well for you, and hope to see you all at some upcoming events soon.
Thank you for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Thanks, folks. Look at all this applause. Well done. Okay, see you all later.